With the Overwatch League heading into its final stage of regular season competition, now seems like as good a time as ever to evaluate and rank teams as we inch closer and closer to the end of season playoffs. The Summer Showdown was fairly enlightening in terms of where specific teams currently stand. To continue this year's tradition, here's another round of power rankings, this time focusing on the Summer Showdown tournament and those results. As usual, the video will start off with my overall rankings, then briefly touch upon how things look from the standpoint of a regional split. If you care more about the split rankings, feel free to jump ahead to the allotted timestamp, but just remember that it's here in my overall rankings where I really go into detail on my thought process and rankings. Alright, with intros out of the way, let's get right into it. Starting off at the number 20 spot is the LA Valiant. An 0-12 map score gives them the title of the worst team in the league performance-wise during the most recent tournament, and I can't exactly say I'm surprised. They're on track to be the worst team of all time from a map win percentage. The Valiant continue to offer next to nothing with every passing stage, and there's basically no promise at all. There's no need to really explain this, you know? They're the worst, no ifs, ands, or buts. Anyway, as we move on to the number 19 spot, there's no other team you can really put besides the Vancouver Titans. Their one and only map win is far less than everybody else aside from the Valiant. They're essentially the NA version of their winless counterpart. They lack the firepower and explosiveness to make a dent in any sort of game plan. Vancouver's commitment to veterans and talent from contenders after the whole runaway falling out has been a disaster. Not to sound like a jerk, but the only thing they're really good for currently is a free win on the schedule. I want to be positive and say I'm hopeful they can turn it around, but when you take one map in 13 attempts, you're not exactly giving me many opportunities. They were by far the worst performing team in their region in the Summer Showdown, so there's no way they could be any higher than 19th. As cruel as it may sound, it's the truth, and that's all there is to it. Number 18, the London Spitfire. Ah yes, the final member of the winless trifecta. Luckily for the Spitfire, they showed some type of progress unlike their counterparts they often get associated with. If I'm being honest, they probably would have gone higher up in the rankings had they gotten to win this stage, because they did show signs of life during week 11. Looking okay against Paris at times and taking the shock at the distance is something to feel proud of. They still have a ton of work to do, but they're getting there. They showed me energy. As for their overall Summer Showdown performance, I felt obligated to tack off a few points for not being as competitive in Week 13. Even the likes of Florida showed slightly more fight, and that was with a messed up main tank situation. They weren't the greatest in this month overall, but the improvements are apparent, which could make you feel at least a little bit optimistic about the Countdown Cup if you support the London Spitfire. Number 17, the Florida Mayhem. Yeah, it feels insanely weird to say that. If I'm being honest, they're probably not a bottom 4 team. There might be a team or two ahead of them that they could definitely beat. Just going off their performance, though, they were winless, you know? There's not much you can really say there. They went to a map 5 a few times, but if you're not winning, there's only so high you can be put considering that every other team from here on out snagged at least one win in the Summer Showdown. Florida are not in the best shape. To say it nicely, they're suffering. You'd never think things would turn out this way after their explosive start back in May, but right now, they just don't have it. Their insane talent can't seem to save them from their main tank struggles, which definitely do have them in a chokehold. As fun as it was to watch him play, Checkmate is only going to get you so far. Florida were all over the place this month, and if Checkmate really is their permanent solution, I fear that time is against them. They're playing from behind while crippled. While I'm hopeful they will finish strong because I really like their roster, their Summer Showdown performance has me very concerned coming into this final month of play. Rolling in at the number 16 spot is the Guangzhou Charge, and this is what I meant by there are some teams you'd consider Florida to be better than that just played better overall during the most recent tournament. It was by no means spectacular, but the Charge got a win, something Florida could not, and unlike previous stages where every other game was basically a disaster for the Charge, they actually did manage to hold their own against Seoul in a 5-map series. It's not much, but that's still improvement. However, this kind of performance still does earn them bottom 5 status. It was still the second worst overall performance from their region, and their overall map win percentage is lower than everybody else on this list. The Charge are not stable. They're like that student who does the bare minimum to pass in a class. They get their one win that they need to pass, and they're fine with it. Keep in mind, this is without hero pools as well. There was no limitations on what they could be trying, but nothing seemed to work effectively, and with no true hit scan specialist on the roster still, the Charge lack the flexibility to keep up with a majority of their opposition. It's unfortunate, but the Summer Showdown has all but assured this will be the end of the road for them. Number 15, The Toronto Defiant. I know it may feel disrespectful when considering they went 2-2, but their overall play did not impress the way it did with other teams who posted the same record. I just didn't see it out there. Beating Vancouver in a messed up mayhem just doesn't do it for me. It's not a knock on them, trust me, I do like this team, but if that's all they have to show for their efforts, they aren't really giving me much of a choice. They certainly are your average run-of-the-mill team who clearly has potential but is unable to truly realize it. They're better than all of your bottom-tier teams out there, but that leaves them as one of the worst okay tier teams at best. I'm liking the energy that Aspire brings, but the rest of the team is not consistently matching it, and that was a big problem during this most recent tournament, and that's something they definitely have to fix if they want any sort of chance of climbing up in the standings. Number 14. The Philadelphia Fusion. I never ever thought I'd see myself putting Philly even lower than I did last month, but here we are, because let's call it how it is. Their Summer Showdown left a lot to be desired as they often felt like a mediocre team. It's a shame too when considering what they're working with, but that's how it is. The Fusion struggled to get much of anything going during the Summer Showdown as they seemed pretty lifeless both in the NYXL and Shanghai games. And I mean, letting that reverse sweep happen at the hands of Chengdu was incredibly deflating, and all of it has left this team in a very weird spot where we know they're capable of turning it around and playing a lot better than what they've shown us recently, but they just look so defeated out there. Whenever anything at all went wrong, it was over. They could not handle any sort of resistance. Not to mention that they were very lost with a lineup and composition standpoint. One week, EQO's on Sombra, then Carpe plays her the next. One week, Toby's getting some sort of playtime, then he doesn't really even touch the stage. Philly are in this awkward transition phase, and I kind of get the feeling that not having their English side of their roster there right off the bat has really screwed things up. Just when they had gotten accustomed to a fully Korean lineup, everything changes mid-season. I'm not saying this is a major reason for their struggles necessarily, but it would definitely make sense if it was. It could easily throw off your game. It would be different if those guys maybe were coming off the bench this year and they had them for practice and scrims at the very least, but the likes of EQO and Funny Astro hadn't been practicing with the team much, you'd have to imagine, up until recently. The situation should improve in theory, but with time against them, it may be too late. At number 13, you've got the NYXL. This may seem a little low given their second consecutive appearance in the knockouts, but they didn't do all that much to impress me. They beat Philly in dominant fashion, yeah, and they almost took down the Spark, which is cool and all, but there just wasn't much to show beyond that. In my eyes, they're a decent mid-tier team. They take care of business to put themselves in a decent position, but then they aren't really competitive enough in the big games. The NYXL have yet to convince me they're truly above average. That could of course change with time, but right now that is not the case. The good news though is the addition of Kalios has proven to be a step in the right direction. He put out some really strong performances as soon as he got signed really. As he gets more comfortable in this team environment, surely you'll see even more of them, which could in turn make this team even more formidable. And if he can become a true star for the NYXL, then they could end up having a pretty scary trio of Kalios, Jonek, and Flora. Sounds pretty good if you ask me. Number 12, the Hangzhou Spark. Back down to bottom half of the league they go. It's kind of difficult to defend the Spark. Going from such a dominant stage to just average leaves me with not a lot of options. If you're going to give us an average stage, then you must be a pretty average team currently. It sounds stupid, yes, but that's kind of what they showed us. But unfortunately, I can't even blame the players all that much, you know? They really are in a really bad situation that's not totally their fault. The Spark literally have a revolving door at their head coaching position. Every single month there has been a new face taking control of the team, which means a new style and philosophy to adapt to. Honestly, the Spark should be happy they went 2-2 despite the internal mess. Things could have been a whole lot worse, but with these glaring inconsistencies and issues in mind, it's hard to rate them very highly or see them as a major threat on a consistent basis. Number 11. The Boston Uprising. It took a few stages, but they're finally moving up in the world, and they truly deserve it for outputting yet another solid qualifier. Admittedly speaking, a few of their wins weren't anything to write home about, but they did make up for it with an absurdly dominant win over Houston. And I mean it when I say this game was one of the most surprising outcomes of the year for me. Even if Boston won that game, I did not think they'd be doing it in 3-0 fashion. If you thought that, I think it's time to get a lottery ticket. Your luck is insane. But anyway, this kind of win sends a statement. Regardless of meta understanding and how much they prepared for Dallas, Houston were still noticeably better on paper, but Boston cruised through that game like it was basically nothing at all. The full potential of Valentine and Myungbung as a duo was put on display for the world to see. Now I'd like to see them do it against a quality team who has a good grasp on the meta and one who takes them 100 100% seriously. It feels like all of Boston's impressive wins this year don't have both of those boxes checked off, and when those conditions are met, they usually end up losing, and that's why I can't put Boston any higher than mid-tier currently. Number 10. The Paris Eternal. What an incredible turn of events for a franchise that once appeared to be doomed. Literally, since the start of this season, this team has gone nowhere but up. With each and every stage, they have gotten stronger. The Summer Showdown is no exception to this pattern either. You can certainly argue they are top 10 in the league currently. If not, you have to admit they definitely did have a top 10 performance in this tournament at the very least. They're not some joke anymore. The Paris Eternal demand your respect. A few top NA teams learned that the hard way as well. A 3-1 stage including a reverse sweep against the Gladiators and solid performances in a losing effort against the Justice and Shock is worthy of a lot of praise. This squad's confidence is at an all-time high. Preseason expectations are meaningless right now. A strong Eternal coaching staff plus some incredible performances out of the Eternal as a collective unit have propelled them into respectable territory. I really gotta give it up to Onigod, Naga, and Khan in particular, who truly have put on some masterclass performances as of late. The Paris Eternal are explosive, and they work like a true team. They're fun to watch as well. Now it's a matter of winning a few more of those big matchups. If they could overcome, let's say, Dallas next week, or at least have a good Countdown Cup tournament run, then they'll surely take that next step towards getting higher than top 10. But until then, this is where they stay. Number 9. The San Francisco Shock. Yeah. This is real life. ATP bumping down the Shock multiple rankings. Who would have thought? But it's no longer something I can deny. The Shock are not the same dominant franchise. They showed signs of struggles and confusion throughout most of the Summer Showdown, as there was not a single instance of them truly dominating. And they lost to a few NA teams who clearly have moved past them for the time being. While I refuse to completely rule them out until it's over, I recognize they are absolutely close to the bottom tier of top 10 status. Their 2-2 performance, which included a 5-map series with the winless London Spitfire, is kind of alarming. They don't seem to be in the right place with their support position, ladies and gentlemen. We've seen everybody be shuffled around at this point. Violet's been playing main support with more frequency, which is not a great sign, and there's a lot of experimentation going on right now. And this time of year is not the best time to be messing around with that kind of stuff, so that's not a great look. But sadly, they feel like there's no other choice. While his overall performances haven't been awful, FD God's style of play has not been one which has meshed well with the Shocks. It goes to show you that this team really does miss Moth. It's weird to see a franchise of this magnitude showing visible confusion. It's not something we've seen often as of late, that's for sure. It goes without saying, though, that their current level of play will not cut it. They were mediocre this stage, and that's gotta change, or that 3P is as good as gone. Number 8. The Houston Outlaws. I'd be lying to you if I didn't admit the disappointment I'm feeling with these guys. How they go from being in control one week to getting bodied the next is something I don't quite understand. They were moving fast in week 11 with some big time performances on that double shield comp, but as soon as they got a week off and the team start to make adjustments to the meta, they immediately start to falter. They stuck to their guns, but it didn't always work out for them, as shown by the disappointing sweeps at the hands of Boston and Dallas. They stuck with that double shield comp for way too long, and by the time they started making changes, it was too late. Their once really good looking position to make the tournament became nothing more than an afterthought. The loss against Boston is what really does it for me, though. I could maybe understand losing in like a close upset, but this wasn't even a contest. The Boston Uprising destroyed the Houston Outlaws, and it has left many of us wondering if they can put it all together by the time playoffs roll around. If they can never win when it truly matters, then why take them as a serious threat at all? It's something they have to work on, and ultimately, it is the reason that they have come in at number 8 on this list. Number 7. The Seoul Dynasty. Oh, Seoul. You're so close and yet so far. Another grand opportunity to get wasted at the hands of a Chengdu team that they definitely could have beaten had they played a bit cleaner in Map 5. That is now 2 different occasions where they played a winnable game against the Hunters in the knockouts, resulting in a loss. It's a disappointment for sure, but honestly, the fact that Chengdu got as far as they did makes Seoul's loss look not as bad. When you think about what the Hunters did, it's not that bad now, is it? And of course, the Dynasty showcased yet another consistent stage with a 3-1 outing. The Dynasty may not be competing in tournaments currently, but they're consistently solid. The Summer Showdown was no different either, and consistently solid is something that pretty much every team below them has not shown. I dig Seoul's overall performance in the month of July. The problem is they can never make it matter. Sure, they're on track to potentially qualify for the playoffs without even having to go through play-ins, but they haven't exactly made it easy on themselves. By missing out on all tournaments so far, they're allowing other teams behind them to stay in the race for second. They're the Eastern version of the Outlaws in that regard, and if that's the case, they have work to do. At your number 6 spot is the LA Gladiators. You could make an argument that Seoul should be number 6 instead, and if you feel that way, I understand. They did get more wins in this stage after all, but I for one believe the Gladiators had the more impressive showing even when you factor in the records. And I say that because there was not a single game they weren't in this stage. Every single matchup was winnable until the very end. Big wins over the Shock and Boston were nice, but it's their losses that I kind of respect even more aside from the Paris one, which you definitely do have to tack some points off for because that was a reverse sweep that never should have happened. However, with the Justice, they nearly made the adjustments to take down a team who was only one map away from upsetting Dallas and going to Hawaii. Not to mention that the Glads themselves were also one mere team fight away from going to Hawaii. Had that final fight on Nepal gone a bit differently, they would have gone to Hawaii instead of Atlanta. The point I'm trying to make here is the Glads were competitive no matter who the opponent. They were mere team fights away from beating multiple really good teams. Clearly they had some shortcomings which need to be worked on. However, they still did pull off some very respectable stuff. Number 5, the Washington Justice. They too are pretty comparable to both the Dynasty and the Gladiators. All three of these teams suffered the same fate, falling a few fights short in a map 5 scenario. The Justice nearly beat the best team in the region though in what could have been a pretty major upset at the time. The difference between Washington and the other two is basically that the Justice actually got a noteworthy win this stage in that Glads game. Some might argue that Seoul technically beat Chengdu earlier in the stage before the knockouts, but it doesn't hold as much weight now considering that it wasn't the same Chengdu team as just a few weeks later. That's the slight edge the Justice have going for themselves. They had that one oopsie at the start of the stage, but after that, the Justice played some fairly clean Overwatch. They outputted a fairly consistent stage, and in my opinion, they showcased great improvements while doing so. The big takeaway was how fast they improved on Rhine comps throughout the stage. What started off as an apparent weakness that seemed easily exploitable very quickly became a strength for them. As they learned what they were doing wrong, Mag benefited a ton. Just remember, they nearly beat Dallas using it, who beat Atlanta using it multiple times. That might be an indicator that the Justice are now one of the better rush teams in the league, and if rush is a problem they no longer have, surely more of these good stages will be on the way for them heading into the playoffs as well. That could be another potential scenario where they dominate. Number 4, the Atlanta Reign. Well, would you look at that? The Reign managed to show us their June Joust run was not a fluke. They made it back, and they impressed every step of the way. You really got to give them credit for pushing the field multiple times in one stage. And if we're being honest, they probably could have won in the tournament against the Fuel had they not thrown on King's Row. But it's not just the fact that they made another tournament that makes their high placing so deserved. They showed time after time they're the number 2 team out of North America by defeating the only teams that you could really compare to them in the Glads and the Justice. The Atlanta Reign were legit in this tournament. I was very content with what they showed me. I'm not expecting this team to win a tournament or a championship for that matter, but if they're at least putting themselves in a position to do so, then they absolutely have to be considered one of the top dogs in the league. Number 3. The Dallas Fuel. Before everyone starts a riot in the streets, keep in mind what I primarily do these rankings on. I don't care which team you think is better on paper. I care about the results from individual tournaments, and if that's what we're going off, Dallas are top 3. That same dominant form from past tournaments did not show up nearly as often. Others have seemingly caught up as multiple NA teams did give them all they could handle. And I mean, you can't forget about those whoopings from the Hunters. I mean, seriously, those were brutal. It would seem the loss to Shanghai last month was no fluke. Wrecking Ball truly is a problem. Dallas are really good, but people have to start admitting they're not untouchable. Now, of course, if you don't want to count the Chengdu games, then go for it. I don't really care, but I personally do count those losses. They've played these opponents before under the exact same disadvantages, and they have beaten them for that matter. Are you going to tell me all of those wins don't count either? Listen, I get it. The conditions for NA teams in these tournaments aren't the best, but they still lost. Nothing you can do about it. Performance-wise, they were the 3rd best team in the league. I don't make the rules. That's just how it goes. But even so, people have to remember, the field definitely are still a favorite to win it all. Don't let one tournament discourage you. Don't let this tournament make you think otherwise for whatever the reason. Number 2, the Chengdu Hunters. How about that? There's a newcomer here in the top 2. and they did it in spectacular fashion by jumping a whopping 10 spots compared to my June Joust rankings. For the time being, they have mad respect out of me. This was no ordinary run. Many of their guys were playing some of the best Overwatch of their careers, arguably. This especially goes for the likes of Yveltal and Monk, who I was very impressed by, along with Leave, but he's always good. The Hunters have arrived. After the tournament they had, it is safe to say they're currently the number 2 team in APAC. They were quite literally the only team to remotely push Shanghai, and don't even just think about APAC. In general, no team pushed Shanghai the way they did. And that's gotta count for something, right? After all, the Dragons were incredibly dominant this month. They were quite easily the number 1 team in the league as they crushed everybody left and right. So the fact that Chengdu took them to a map 5 is worthy of a lot of praise. But what's worth even more praise, in my opinion, is how clutch they were to get to the finals in the first place. Anytime a big challenge came their way, they handled it with a real it ain't over till it's over mentality. This wasn't some ordinary run where they got lucky or had the pleasure of taking on mediocre competition. No, not at all. They played quality teams and they beat pretty much all of them aside from Shanghai. The Hunters very well finally could have turned the corner. Their consistency might finally be in a decent spot. If they can play at this level for the rest of this year, while maybe getting a little help from the meta, they seriously might overtake Seoul for second place in the conference. Not only that, but a serious playoff run could be in their future. Watch out for the Hunters. They seem stronger than ever. And finally, at number 1, unsurprisingly, we have the Shanghai Dragons. Everybody knew this was coming. Aside from a few of the bottom teams, Shanghai at number 1 was one of the most obvious rankings to make. Another tournament victory makes them the clear-cut kings of the league as it currently stands. That 5 mapper against Chengdu was the only game that really made them sweat during this tournament, plus the qualifiers. They made it look easy. Even the respectable teams of the East mostly got rolled into the dirt. Shanghai bullied pretty much everybody into submission. They were clicking in all ways imaginable. Their meta understanding and strategy was top-notch. Any of their players could take over at any given moment. Plus, the likes of Fleta, Lip, Void, and Fate were making clutch plays on the daily. And to top it all off, they got a nice 4-1 in the finals, which is really sweet. The game was closer than the score implies, but still, the Dragons did take it home by a clear-cut margin. Shanghai didn't just have the best performance in the league this stage. They're the number 1 team, period. Other rosters are close, but Shanghai are clearly the most flexible and most dominant. And with the momentum they're currently riding, I wouldn't be surprised in the slightest if this trend continues for the rest of 2021. They very well could be your league champions. And that's basically going to do it for the full rankings. If you gave this list a preseason me, I would be convinced that this was some sort of prank. It's crazy what a few months of time can do to absolutely destroy your preseason expectations, but that's sports for you. Always full of surprises, am I right? Anyway, let's take a look now at my regional power rankings, and unsurprisingly, for the 3rd month in a row, the Dragons and Fuel reign supreme at number 1 in their respective regions. Your league bottom feeders also look very similar in this format, aside from the Shock and Florida, of course, who both had fairly disappointing stages, which means that they had no other choice but to plummet in the rankings. Some noteworthy winners from the rankings are the Hunters, Justice, and Eternal. The first 2 mentioned went up 3 spots in the regional rankings. In regard to all 3, each of them jumped up by at least 4 spots in the overall rankings. In terms of notable losers, you gotta point fingers at the Shock, Spark, and Mayhem, who all went down at least 5 spots in the overall rankings. You especially gotta feel bad for the Mayhem, who dropped from middle of the pack all the way down to bottom 4. I never thought I'd see the day where I have both Philly and Florida in my bottom 7, Paris in my top 10, and the Shock worse than 5th place. What a crazy world. It goes to show how unpredictable the league has been this year. Sure, it leads to a lot of boomage and wrong predictions on my part, but I don't mind at all. If the teams are defying my expectations by this much, then the league is probably in a really great state entertainment-wise, I would say. And honestly, I wouldn't have it any other way. And that brings this Power Rankings episode to a close. What did you think of my rankings? Were my assessments fair? Were they unfair? What would you change? Let me know what your Power Rankings are currently as well down in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, it would mean so much to me if you could drop a like and sub if you're new around here. And as always, thank you all so much for watching my content. I appreciate each and every one of you. And until next time, this is ATP, signing out. Peace.